gostaria que você começasse nos contando o que os alunos aprendem nesse curso de administração pública.
So we recently established an executive master's program out of the Rio Center, the Global Center of Columbia in Rio. It's a degree program that focuses on management. So students study basic management, finance, statistics, microeconomics, macroeconomics, and then advanced courses in the global economy, in management innovation. It's all focused on what we believe is a new trend, which is public sector, private sector cooperation, or what some people call PPPs, public-private partnerships. So we have students from all three sectors. In this particular program, they're just Brazilians, but beginning this year, we'll add a group of students from the United States, and then in succeeding years from the Middle East, China, and India.
And about Brazil, what do you think about this experience there?
So far, it's been a great experience. The students come from Rio, from São Paulo, from Brasilia, and from some small cities. There are 22 of them. They come from all three sectors. The largest number are from the government, but there are also people from the private and from the NGO sector. They're very smart. English is excellent, and I think they so far have found the program very useful. So we're very optimistic about the future. We're right in the middle of recruiting a second class. We've been helped greatly by the Lemann Foundation, who's helped us develop. It's actually what we call a hybrid model. The students take some of the coursework online, some of it in the Global Center in Rio, and then 2 semesters here live at the Columbia campus, their second and last semester. So it's a mixed model that allows them to keep their jobs, to keep their family, to pay their bills, and also get a graduate degree from Columbia University.
Qual é o impacto na vida profissional desses alunos depois que eles passam por uma formação como essa?
So the degree they actually receive is a master's in public administration. But as we have here at the School of International and Public Affairs, even though it's a degree in public administration, we attract about a third of our students from the private sector, about a third from the NGO sector, and about a third from the government. Again, under this theme, which I believe will dominate this part of the 21st century, of public-private partnerships being essential to get anything important done, like the World Cup in Brazil, like the Olympics, like major subway lines. If you look at the major projects in Brazil over the last 10 or 15 years, they've all been public-private partnerships.
Qual a importância do desenvolvimento da administração pública nos dias de hoje? É uma tendência?
Well, I think it is a global trend, public-private partnerships, for sure. There are actually, I think, 3 major trends that are going on in the public sector these days. So it's public-private partnerships, it's what people call big data and analytics, collecting this massive amount of digital data that we now have available on almost all of us, and using it to design programs that are more beneficial to people. So that's a second trend. And then the third trend is generally known as sustainability. People often associate that with just the environment, but it actually goes to the business model as well, and that is the less resources you waste, the more profit you make. So I think those are the 3 big themes in the public sector globally these days.
Quais são as ferramentas para melhorar a administração pública e evitar a corrupção?
Analytical skills, the ability to look at financial data, social data, environmental data. That's number 1. Number 2 are communication skills, the ability to communicate to the public so that the public truly understands what the public sector is doing. The third is accountability, so that we're doing both financial audits but also performance audits. It's not just enough to eliminate corruption. We also need to get better outcomes. Corruption's a problem, but it's more important that people be served well. So I think we need to balance our attention. If we spend all our time just fighting corruption, people can still starve to death. They'll just do it through an honest process. That's not really a great accomplishment.
Como que os contratos abertos e transparentes podem ajudar nessa questão?
That's critical. Your point is I think, the most important thing. If I could change one thing in Brazil today, it would be the transparency of the contracting process. And it's not just a problem in Brazil, it's a problem in many countries around the world, that countries pass these very rigorous laws which the public can't understand, which contractors can't understand. They're designed to fight corruption, but they actually encourage corruption because no one can figure out the law, so people pay the other side to get through it. The best way to ensure, or the best anti-corruption measure, I think, is to just make these contracts public. Make the process very simple, make it easy to understand, let the public know who's applying, what their bids are, and then it'll be easy to see whether the bid is a good one or a bad one.
Que tipo de administrador público que os governos necessitam, que seria melhor ter na linha de frente do trabalho?
Well, I think increasingly we need people who have a high level of education, whether it's teachers, policemen, firemen, people who work on roads. People, the world we live in today is quite complicated. It really is. And all of us are being held to global standards. So it's not, we used to say good enough for government, which would mean not very good at all. Well, indeed, corporate decisions about where they locate now, companies can locate anywhere in the world because of technology and improvements in telecommunication. So government has to be excellent. And in order to be excellent, people have to be educated and trained. So, and that's from the very top to what we call the street level bureaucrats. So education is key.
No Brasil, muitas empresas públicas têm sido usadas como meio político de conseguir vantagens. Esse seria problema central?
Yes, it is. I think Brazil, China faces the same kind of issue, what are called publicly owned corporations. So the initial idea was a good one. Let's take the parts of government that look like a business and set them up as a business, but have them publicly owned. But they're neither fish nor fowl. They're not government and they're not the private sector. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I think, because there's so much political involvement, they're very prone to corruption. So my own belief is, while we should have cooperation between the sectors themselves should be clearly defined and separated. So if I had a magic wand, I would take these quasi-public corporations in Brazil and make them completely private, take them out of the political sector.
Como que uma formação falha na área de administração pode comprometer a parte ética, o comportamento ético de profissional?
Well, you know, each sector has its own responsibilities, right? So if you work in the private sector, the main goal is to make money. So people are focused on that. I think it is government's job to create an ethical environment and to hold private firms accountable. I don't think you can expect a profit-driven corporation to give up profits in the name of ethics. But government can say, if you don't operate ethically, mm-hmm. you're going to be fined, you're going to be jailed, maybe even ultimately you're taken out of business. So I think the ethical sphere is really the job of government and places like ours, educational institutions who train people. Part of their training should not just be analytics, it should also be ethics.
Como resolver a questão burocrática num país como o Brasil, que é um país federativo, que tem vários níveis de negociação na hora que você quer realizar projeto, por exemplo?
Well, I think the biggest problem, again, which I said earlier, is Brazil is too oriented toward, if we want to fix something, let's pass a law. And so if you look at the legal system, there are books upon books upon books to do everything. And again, my own feeling is that causes corruption. It doesn't prevent corruption. We know what the schools are supposed to do. We know how the roads are supposed to be done. I would simplify the legal system and make the process much more transparent. And I think that would solve a lot of the problems.
Diante da crise brasileira, que oportunidades a gente pode enxergar agora?
Well, I think there's a saying in my business, never waste a good crisis. In Chinese and the Mandarin language, the word for crisis is actually a mixture of two symbols. One, on its own, means danger. The other on its own means opportunity. If you put the two together, they spell crisis. So I would say right now the crisis that Brazil faces in terms of the currency and in terms of oil prices is an opportunity for reform. And I think that's what Brazil should do. They should reform the legal system. They should separate out the public corporations and make them solely private. And they should keep working hard as they've always done. I mean, for all the current troubles, Brazil is still one of the great stories in the world about a country that's moved from developing to highly developed and really still a leader in the world. So we can get overly focused on what's wrong and not look at what's right. Indeed, if you look at the social sector in Brazil, it's actually a model for places around the world. So a great deal of good has been done. If you look at the World Cup, which everyone said would be a disaster, it was a great triumph, except for the Brazil team. Except for the team, everything went well.
Have a chance.
And I think if we look, my expectation is the Olympics will be a big success. And the mayor of Rio is really, truly, by many people's outsiders' eyes, one of the great mayors in the world. So there's a lot to be proud of. There's a lot to be. Paulo Lemann is buying the entire world. You know, a Brazilian company, a Brazilian hedge fund is a dominant force in the world, partners with Warren Buffett.
Qual a primeira coisa que nós deveríamos fazer para começar a mudar?
The corruption is a big problem. And it's not only a big problem, but it's one that's relatively easy to solve, I believe. It's transparency, it's openness, it's separating the government from the private sector. It's not that hard to do. We don't need a new invention. It's not like curing cancer. It's pretty obvious. I mean, if you talk to most politicians and most businessmen in Brazil, they know what the problems are. They just haven't had the discipline to solve them.
Quer dizer que a transparência virou commodities?
It's a word that we use all the time, but we seldom execute on it, right? So we talk the game of transparency, but then we don't do it. I can say from my own personal experience, having negotiated contracts in Brazil, if I didn't love Brazil, if Brazil wasn't so important, if I was just a private sector person, I would never do business in Brazil. It's impossible. It's way, way too hard. And it's too hard because supposedly we're protecting ourselves from corruption, and yet corruption in Brazil is as bad or worse than it is other places. So step number one is to reform the legal system.
A economia no mundo está crescendo em macro-regiões. Como é que o Brasil se coloca diante dessa cena internacional?
Well, I think Brazil is in good position in a lot of ways. First of all, yes, commodity prices go up and down, but Brazil is very rich in important commodities, so that's an advantage. The second is it has a great agricultural sector, which is strong and needed. Pretty soon we'll have 9 billion people in the world, so the need for food is high in Brazil, a very efficient producer. It has a very diverse population. It's the biggest country in Latin America. It's very sophisticated in terms of its educational system. It just needs to, the problem is it's not widespread. So the top levels of public and private universities in Brazil are excellent, but they're accessible to a very limited number of people. So it seems to me the key there is to spread that education and make it widely accessible.
You said many times corruption, corruption, corruption. And can good administration and laws prevent corruption?
I think if we look at the recent experience in Brazil, laws alone can't do the trick. So it's not just the politicians, it's not just the business leaders. I would argue that the Brazilian people have not demanded loud enough that corruption be stopped. Now, to be fair, the average person has a lot more on their mind than corruption. They're worried about feeding their family. They're worried about the economy. They're worried about jobs. I think what is needed is a leader to embrace this quest and actually to translate to the public how corruption hurts them, how corruption is a drag on the economy, how corruption keeps international business out. I think if the public really understood the relationship between corruption and the quality of their life, they'd demand change. I don't think it's clear to them right now. How does this affect me?
Qual a sua opinião sobre os programas de compliance nas empresas?
Well, again, that's, compliance is catching people after the fact. So again, I think we need to be proactive. We need to establish a culture of openness and honesty. And then catching the bad guys afterward. A lesson from New York. When I was young in New York City was the most dangerous big city in the world, even though its police force was respected as one of the most effective in going after bad guys and catching them. Bill Bratton, who's the police commissioner again today, in 1994 came in and said, you guys have got this whole thing backwards. The job is not to catch criminals, it's to stop crime. You got to focus on stopping crime before it happens, not catching criminals afterward. You'll never get ahead. And I think the corruption story in Brazil is exactly that. We got to start switching and start trying to create an honest culture rather than let's redouble our effort to catch bad guys. You have to reform the system, and then compliance and accountability will work. If you don't reform the system, if you don't have a system that actually goes after prevention rather than apprehension, you'll never get ahead of the game.
Who decide to change the situation? The people?
Well, I mean, it is very much a chicken and egg, right? If the people demand it, the leaders will do it. But I think the people don't understand how important corruption is as an issue in Brazil, so it's leadership. It is. And I'm a management professor. I've been a manager in the public and the private sector. Leadership is key. So you need someone, I don't know who, but someone, and it has to be at the national level, to say enough is enough. Things have to change. Again, as we said earlier, it's a great time because everyone thinks there's a crisis. People feel there's a crisis. The financial situation is creating a crisis. So someone has to step up and say, I'm going to fix this problem.
Como fazer a administração pública lugar mais atrativo para as novas gerações?
That's a great question. How do we get the best and the brightest to go into government rather than follow Georgie Paulo Lemann and get rich? And that's a difficult question. I'm old. I've been around a long time, so there's very few advantages of being old other than it's better than being dead. But one advantage of being older is that you have a lot of experience. And I never forgot, when I was a young person, John Kennedy was elected President of the United States. And in his most memorable speech, in his inaugural speech, he said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And again, this gets back to leadership. And at that time, when I was a young person, I wanted to go work in government. I wanted to help make the world a better place. So I think the way to get people to go into the public sector is not by trying to make the public sector competitive with the private sector in terms of financial rewards. It never can be. I think what you have to do is inspire people that they can make the world a better place. And a lot of people will choose to do that if they really believe they have the opportunity. The other thing is, people are living longer and longer and longer. So you don't have to spend your entire career in government. If you're healthy, you could spend 20 years in the government, 20 years in the NGO sector, and 20 years in the private sector. So you can have it all.
Por que o brasileiro não se sente dono do que é público? Ele não se sente responsável pelo que é público?
My own thoughts are there are a number of reasons. I think one is that Brazil is a very wonderful place, so that people get focused on their own lives, enjoying the weather and enjoying the beauty and the beautiful people and the beautiful music and art. And so I think in part people are distracted by at least the physical beauty of Brazil. That's one. I think number two, that things have been getting better slowly but surely in Brazil for a long time. So there wasn't that sense of urgency, we got to fix things, because things were getting better. Now, with trouble, I think that may inspire people. The other thing is Brazil is a very big country, and it's a very diverse country. And so developing that sense of country and Brazil rather than my region, my city, my family, my art, that takes time. That takes time. And I think as we globalize worldwide, I think national identities are strengthening. Because every day now we're confronting in the news what happened in Paris, what happened in Turkey, what's happening in Syria.
It's true.
And the more you look at the whole world, I think the more it makes you say, oh, my perspective is I'm a Brazilian. Now, that doesn't make me necessarily unsympathetic to Syria, but the more and more I look at other countries, I think it forces one to identify with the country that they're from and realize that this is not a competition within Brazil anymore. This is a competition globally. And at least I think the nation state for a long time will be the defining level in a global competition.
Professor, muito obrigada pela sua entrevista e bem-vindo ao UM Brasil.
Thank you.